那我们今天的这个结束讲座，我们很高兴很荣幸的请到了Dixon 教授。Dixon 教授呢，我做一个简单的介绍，他是我在英国卡迪夫大学的博士生导师，他在卡迪夫大学工作了长达12年时间，在那里做经济学教授。而在之前呢，他是英国约克大学的经济系主任教授，同时他在92年担任过英国皇家经济学会年会主席。他曾经在 American Economic Review of Economics and Studies and Economic Journal 这些非常好的这个顶尖的杂志上面，他发表过很多的这个很重要的文章，很有影响力的文章。他早期的研究呢是偏重于这个组织以及微观，而在2000年以后呢，他的这个研究的重心主要在这个新凯恩斯宏观经济学。讲一讲他在这个新凯恩斯宏观经济学的这个微观基础方面所做的一系列的研究的一个总结。Welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me here to give a talk. What I want to talk about is nominal rigidity, why it's important in economics, particularly macroeconomics, and how to measure it. So, what do we mean by nominal rigidity? We mean that nominal prices which are denominated in the currency, so it would be the price in RMB or the price in dollars, and where nominal prices are rigid when they don't change, they remain fixed for a long period of time. Now, I give you some examples here. These are some stores which, as you can see, Poundland is from England, and everything is £1. So the price is £1 all the time. We also have Daiso, which is a Japanese store. I don't know if you have it here, but this is actually a Daiso store from Singapore, where everything is $2 And I think Daiso also operates in the United States as well. And the £1 is an example. There are also 99p stores, so there are some different prices, but in these stores the price is always fixed. And indeed, if we go back into history, there's a very famous store in Britain called Marks and Spencer's. I don't know if it is in China, but it's a very famous store in Europe and in Britain. And it started off from what's called a penny bazaar. Bazaar is a word meaning a shop. So it was a stall where everything sold for 1 penny. So the fact that these shops exist might indicate that prices remain fixed for a long time. There are two questions which I'm going to look at. One is why such nominal rigidity might be important, and secondly, how do you measure it? How do you measure it? And I'm going to apply this to two countries, France and England. And in fact, research on England, some of it was done by me and Kun together using British data. And lastly, we'll look at the implications of this for economics in general, and more specifically for macroeconomics. So why is nominal rigidity important? Well, let's look at what most economics is about. When we look at economics, we look at the real economy, and often we ignore nominal prices. So in certain topics that you study, like international trade, tax theory and so on, you don't have nominal prices, you just look at real or relative prices. And relative prices are what matter. So typically what you assume in economics, if you're looking at a general equilibrium system, is that you have one price is the numeraire, and you express all prices in terms of that numeraire. So in general equilibrium, nominal prices are often irrelevant. Okay, but in order to adopt that approach, you need to assume that nominal prices are perfectly flexible. They always adjust to reflect the underlying real or relative prices. In practice, that means that they ought to be able to change every period, so the prices should be able to change every period, and that gives rise to what's called, in the history of economic thought, the classical dichotomy. Dichotomy is a Greek word which means to cut into two. So when we look at the economy, there's the real side of the economy, which is relative prices, and the nominal side of the economy, that's nominal prices, just reflects money, if you like, and it acts as a veil. So this is an old idea in economics. It goes back to the British philosopher David Hume in the 18th century, and it goes even further back. There are some Islamic scholars from the Middle Ages who put forward this idea. So this was the way that people looked at it in the past. But in the 1930s, some economists realised that prices weren't perfectly flexible, and they looked at the data. So there were two particular economists, both American. There was Gardiner Means, who developed the notion of administered prices, and he looked at some data. The data he looked at was the Bureau of Labour Statistics. That's one of the main statistical agencies in America. And he looked at wholesale prices for a list of items over the period 1926 to 33, and he found that a lot of them didn't change price frequently. So 50% changed less than once every 4 months, and 25% less than once every 10 months, and 13% less than once a year. And another study was done by Rufus Tucker, and he said, well, look, this doesn't only apply to the current data. So Gardner Means was looking at recent data, in his case in the period 1926 to 1933, but Rufus Tucker looked back in history. There was quite a lot of, he looked at US historical data, and he found that this had been much the same throughout the whole of the 19th century. So for a long time, if you looked at the data that was available on US prices, there's a lot of nominal rigidity there. Tucker also looked at Adam Smith and said that really this had been known about in the past, but people had forgotten about it. So this led to a long debate. There's a famous paper by Stigler and Kindle in 1970 about what this is, but basically I think that there was a lot of evidence for nominal rigidity in the US economy. Now clearly, some prices are more flexible than others. Some, as we'll see later in my talk, some prices do change all the time, once a month, once a day. But there is a big fat tail. There are a lot of prices which only change price very, very infrequently. So I'm just going to do a little bit of theory now, not too much, don't worry. So I just want to show that if nominal prices are rigid, or some nominal prices are rigid, these can influence the way the whole economy operates. And I'll give you an example. This is taken from some work I did. It was published in the early 1990s, but the original discussion paper versions were in the late 80s. And it's a very simple idea. So if we have a general equilibrium system, there are many equations. But essentially, we're going to have some equation which will express prices, real prices, in terms of the disutility of labour, one of the inputs. So, for example, in this equation, we've got we've got a price index, which is the price of the consumption good, which will depend on some of the goods in the economy. Here I have three goods. The price of the unionised wage, the fixed price and the competitive wage. And the real wage will be a markup over the disutility of labour. So the markup, it depends on the elasticity of demand, and takes the following formula. Don't worry if you don't follow the details. The main point is that the price index, which depends on the three prices, is homogeneous of degree 1. If you double all prices, you double the price index. and the price index measures the cost of living. So the nominal wage will depend on the cost of living, because what workers are interested in is the real wage, how much real consumption good they can purchase with their wage. So this is a market for the real wage in a unionised sector, and I also look at a competitive sector where this is the competitive wage, and that again will be a real wage. It's the nominal competitive wage divided by the real price, by the consumer price index. That will be equal to a disutility of labour. So this is some sort of a general equilibrium system might have pricing equations that look like this. So what we can show is that if some sectors are rigid, this can give rise to the flexible prices also becoming rigid. Nominal rigidity is a little bit infectious. So if some prices don't change, that can lead to other prices which could change, not changing. So let's take an example here that might be a little bit more straightforward. Suppose you have just the two sectors. So there's a proportion alpha of economy, the prices are fixed, and in a proportion 1 minus alpha, they're flexible. So the price index includes both the fixed prices and the flexible prices. That's the key thing. So that when we look at the real, in the flexible sector, Z here is the flexible sector. In the flexible sector, the real price, the price of the flexible sector relative to the cost, the price index, is equal to the constant theta. So that's with Cobb-Douglas preferences, it takes that form. Now, doing a little bit of mathematics on that, very simple mathematics, you can see that the competitive wage, Z, will be proportional to the fixed price, which means, effectively, that the fixed price is pegged, sorry, the competitive price is pegged to the fixed price. And this is an important point. Ah, great, thanks. And it's got a pointer as well?
Yes, but I will show it.
Ah, right, I see. Okay, thanks. So I hope I can operate this. So the flexible prices become pegged to the fixed prices. The nominal rigidity is totally infectious. And there's a way of switching it off. Okay. Ah, great, thanks. Thank you. So this is a special case because it relies on this, the disutility of labour, being constant. Now, of course, you can generalise this, and you can get some other equations which allow for, say, an upward sloping labour supply curve, so that as you supply more labour, the real wage will go up, or the real price will go up. That might look something like this, so that this is the labour supply or employment, and the disutility of labour will depend on that. And that gives you an upward sloping supply curve, and you can combine that with a demand curve which says the demand is equal to, say, the money supply divided by the price, a simple quantity theory. So you have a demand and a supply curve, and you can then solve for the competitive price. I won't go into the details here, but essentially you can see here that, again, the flexible price is linked in some way to the fixed price. And what that means, so it's just like a demand curve here. Here is the supply curve, and there's a demand curve. And the implication of that is that money becomes non-neutral in this economy, because if you increase the money supply, i.e. you shift this demand curve to the right, then there'll be an increase in supply of the competitive good. And you know, it will depend how the competitive sector responds to the increase in the money supply will depend on alpha, which is the share of the fixed priced sector in the economy. So if there were no fixed prices, then basically this would effectively be zero. There'd be the flexible price sector output, the output in the flexible price sector wouldn't vary with the money supply. But as you can see, if there is a fixed price sector, if alpha is bigger than zero, that will cause the money supply to influence output in the competitive sector. So there's a few equations there, don't worry if you haven't followed them. The main point is that the fact that some prices are fixed means that the prices which aren't fixed will respond less to changes in demand. That's the important point. Now these are just a couple of equations. A whole general equilibrium system will have lots of other equations, but there will be some equations a little bit like this. And so these equations, these conclusions will follow over. This is the case. I've focused here on the macroeconomic aspect, looking at the way the money supply can affect output. But there will be other examples. For example, just to go back to the first equation, here we have a markup equation here, which gives a real equilibrium price in terms of a markup over something. Well, a lot of things look like that in economics. When we look at oligopoly pricing or tax models, typically we'll get some sort of equation that looks like that. And again, if some prices are fixed, it's going to alter the way that the flexible prices will behave, and more specifically, it will alter the way that the flexible prices respond to changes in taxation and other such factors. And indeed, this idea has sort of caught on a little bit. There's a recent paper by two American economists, Pete Hunan and Jonathan Willis, 2016, which indeed shows how the monopolistic markups affected by nominal rigidities in another sector. And nominal rigidity causes other sorts of spillovers. I've focused here in this talk up till now just on the fact that the fixed price is in the price index. So that's like a cost of living effect. It spills up, but it spills over in different ways, which I explored in the papers back in the early 1990s. You have budget share effects. If relative prices change, then households change their budget shares, the shares of expenditures. They shift their demand from one sector to another. So you can have budget share effects and also elasticity markup effects. The markups can change as well. So there's three sorts of effects. My talk just really focused on the one effect, but in the papers I go through all of these three different effects, and they're all there. So that's basically the theory. Now, it's quite a simple model that I've put forward. What about if you look at a dynamic general equilibrium model, a more complicated model? Well, the effect is also going to be there. I mentioned the more recent paper by Hunan and Willis, but I've also looked at this in earlier papers myself, where we have nominal rigidity in one sector, for example, a Taylor staggered contract model. So that some sectors prices adjust slowly, and in others prices are perfectly flexible. What sort of thing do we get there? Well, I can just show you very nicely cleaned up impulse response functions. So this is two impulse response functions of output. It comes from the paper I wrote with Engin Kara back in 2010. So I'll come over here. So in the first, this is the output response. So we look at a monetary shock, and what we have is we have a response of output which over time dies away. It looks like that. Against that we have an economy which has the same average length of price spells, but in one part of the economy, most of the economy, prices are flexible, but in a small part of the economy, I think it's 1/7 of the economy, that's 1/7, the prices are fixed, adjust much more slowly. They're not completely fixed, but they last for 7 quarters. So and here we see what happens is the output response is much more persistent. It lasts for much longer than it does in a simple Taylor model where all prices last for 2 quarters. So the mean length of price spells is exactly the same with these 2 lines, but in one, everything has in all sectors price lasts for 2 periods, so they're quite flexible. Whereas with the blue line, 6/7 of the economy are perfectly flexible, so the majority of the economy is perfectly flexible in the prices, but in 1/7 of the economy, the prices last for 8 periods. And that gives rise to much more persistence. Those 8-period contracts, which last for a long time, alter the way the whole economy behaves and adjusts. So in static models, you get these costs of nominal rigidity spilling over. You get it also in dynamic models as well. So that's, if you like, the theory. But certainly one of my research themes in recent years has been to look at this, how you can explain the persistence of output and inflation as a result of the fact that in some sectors there's a lot of nominal rigidity. And I think it provides a good explanation of why this can happen, whereas other explanations, we'll talk about it later, have had more difficulty to do it. So just to conclude the first part of my talk, it is that nominal rigidity matters. In a general equilibrium system, the fact that some prices are rigid will affect the way the whole system behaves. Now, of course, I'll put a caveat on that. It depends exactly what assumptions you make about labour supply, elasticities, preferences, and so on. So under certain assumptions, this spillover will be very, very small. But it can also be very, very big. You can look at the details in the papers. They're on my website on hughedixon.org if you want to have a look at the assumptions, alternative assumptions that you can make. And clearly, nominal rigidity will lead to these real effects, which you can think it's not just to do with monetary policy. It is to do with monetary policy, of course, but it also has real effects which go beyond monetary policy. Demand might change for many reasons. There might be other changes going on. The way the whole system responds to changes in general, even productivity shocks, things like that, will depend on how rigid nominal prices are. So that's the theory. Are there any questions anybody has at this stage? No? Okay, well I'll go on to the next part, which is how to measure nominal rigidity. So this is something I've been looking at quite a lot in the last decade or so. And so what we can do is we can look at how price setters, who sets prices? It's shops and firms. And we can look at how often they set prices. So we can go back, like Gardner Means and Rufus Tucker back in America in the 1930s, and we can ask the same sort of question. And I'll be showing you in some detail how you can answer this question looking at the UK and French Consumer Price Index price micro data. I'll explain that later. And we can look at the average duration of prices. How long do prices last? And the question is, what do you average over? Now, it might seem a very simple question, what do you average over? But in fact, it's a simple question, but some people, I think, have taken an approach which isn't the most informative. So let's look at prices and price setters. I'll call these price setters firms. Of course, I'm using firms as a general term here. Of course, in practice, it's often shops. I don't use it in a specialist meaning. So we'll just talk about firms here. So suppose there are n firms in an economy, and each firm is Taylor-like, in the sense it's like the theory of Taylor's theory of price setting. Each firm sets a price regularly after a number of periods. So, for example, If you're tailor 2, you set a price for 2 periods, and then for another 2 periods, and then for another 2 periods. If you're tailor 1, you set a price every period. If you're tailor I, then you set a price for I periods. And we simply assume that the maximum number of periods is F. F could be a very large number. It could be 44, 100, or 1,000. But firms set prices for different lengths of time. So if we averaged over those firms, we'd average, there are F different types, F different firms, and some set for prices for 1 period, for 2 periods, for 3 periods, for 4 periods, up to F. If we take an average of integers from 1 to F, our mean will be F plus 1 over 2. So if F was 11, then we have one firm that sets prices for 1 period, one firm for 2 periods, up to 11. Then the average length of prices set will be 12 over 2, 6. Okay, so that gives you one way of averaging across firms. Sorry, wrong way. You can generalize this a little bit, and there's something which is called a generalized Taylor economy, where lots of firms, and rather than assuming there's one firm sets it for 1 month, two for another firm for 2 months, we assume there's a distribution. These are proportions which are strictly positive and add up to 1. So 10% of firms maybe set prices every month, 5% set them every 2 months, and so on and so forth. Those proportions are given by the alpha I. The alpha I sum up to 1. Because they're proportions, and so we can then define the mean price length, the mean length of prices set as simply being the length of duration of prices set weighted by proportion. So 10% set it for 1 period, that would be 1 times 0.1. 5% for 2 periods would be 2 times 0.05, and so on. And we'd add it up and find the mean. So that's one way of looking at things. Another way of looking at things, this is something some work I did with the Bank of England. We actually used the CPI sector weights. We looked at the consumer price index, and we weighted each type of price by its contribution to the CPI index. And we then looked within each CPI index how we allowed for different durations within each index, and again we were able to come up with an average price length. I'll come to what it is later. So this is roughly how things the way that we can think of things. If we look at the UK, just to give you a concrete advantage, there's a list of different categories that are in the CPI index, the Consumer Price Index. There'll be a similar. The Consumer Price Index is an international standard, so there'll be a Chinese Consumer Price Index, which will have the same sort of items in it. So we've got non-alcoholic beverages, alcohol and cigarettes, clothing and footwear, housing and water, furniture and household, and miscellaneous, the last one. So here are 12 categories. And for each category there's a different colour. What we have here is, this is a period of time, quarters, this is 1 quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters. And this, so if we take one of the lines, let's take non-alcoholic beverages, then this is the proportion of non-alcoholic beverages that change price every quarter. This is the proportion that change every 2 quarters, 3 quarters, 4 quarters, 5 quarters, etc. So for each line is a distribution of how long prices last in terms of quarters for each category within the Consumer Price Index. As you can see, there's a lot of heterogeneity. Non-alcoholic beverages, there's a lot of the prices, if we read across here, this is over 40% of prices change price every month, every quarter, sorry. Whereas in other sectors, which one is this? This is restaurants and hotels, I think. Is that right? Restaurants and hotels, I think?
Housing and water, isn't it?
Or is it housing and water? But anyway, no, I think that's housing and water. Well, both of these two. I think that's housing and water and that's restaurants and hotels. Very few change price each month. Most of them last longer. You'll notice that there's a big jump in most of these at 12 quarters. 12 quarters is 3 years, 4 years. That's simply because we truncated the data there. So this is 4 years or more. So that's roughly what you see when you look at the British data, CPI data. And that's answered. Now, let's look in a bit more detail over what we mean by averaging over what. So I just took the idea there of averaging over prices. So I'll now introduce to you the actual CPI microdata, and there'll be an equivalent microdata for China, but in the UK and France, in the UK it's public now. In France it's not public, but I had access to it. But in China it's not public yet, so hopefully this research could be done in China. Maybe one of you could do it. So what happens is that each month prices are collected across a range of goods. So it's about 500 or 600 goods, and they collect about 100,000 prices. I don't know what the figure is in China, but that's the sort of number of prices, observations that are made in France and the UK. These are put together into a price index, the CPI price index, which is published once a month, every month. And those are used to construct the inflation figures. So when you look at the newspaper and it says that inflation in China is now 5%, it will have been that figure will have come from looking at hundreds of thousands of prices across a range of products and a range of geographical areas in China. And it's the same, obviously, in the UK and France. If we look at the UK and France, we can get the data going back monthly into the mid-90s. The data was collected before the mid-90s, but it doesn't exist anymore, or it's on pieces of paper or cards which nobody can find. In the US, they've now got it going back further, back to the 1980s. They managed to recover some of this data, and in Norway even earlier. So the CPI price data exists for most countries, and we can think of it as what's called in econometrics a panel. So a panel is basically a series of rows. It's a series of rows, data which is in a series of rows. So each row is a sequence of price quotes for a particular commodity or good at the same location. A column is a list of prices, what the prices are. So you can think of those as one per firm. It's a list of firms. It's actually a price of a particular shop. And these prices are put together using CPI weights, which are used to construct the CPI index. The weights happen because some items are more important than others. So some items will have a big weight, like bread, whereas others, champagne, will have quite a small weight. So it's a bit like a wall. So you can look at it, a panel is a bit like a wall where along the horizontal rows you have the bricks, which are the, well, I just mentioned something out. You can use this data to construct price spells. So you've got the price quotes, and you can combine the price quotes as you go along a row. If the price quotes are the same, that means you have a period when the price hasn't changed. And that's called a price spell, or a duration, a price duration or a price spell. So you can construct, you can answer the question, how long do prices remain unchanged, by looking at this data and looking at for periods for each price when the price hasn't changed. And there's actually been a lot of CPI data became available to some people in the early 2000s. And so there was the Inflation Persistence Network in the Eurozone. So there were many studies of France, Italy, Germany and so on. And in America, there were the famous studies by Pete Clenow and Mark Bills and Clenow and Christoph, Nakamura and Stuyvesant. There are a few studies done there, and in the UK, there was some done by the Bank of England by Bud and Ellis, and some by myself and Kun Tian for the UK. So we looked at it. So what does this data tell us about nominal rigidity? So there are millions, I'll just quote, we're looking at 100,000 observations per month over many months, over 2 decades. So there are millions and millions of price observations here. So what does this data tell us about how rigid nominal prices are? So the first thing I'll do is talk about the distribution of durations. So early research focused on the distribution of duration. So it asked the question, well, how many price spells have a particular duration? How many price spells last for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months? Now, this is an interesting question, but it sort of ignores that panel structure I was telling you about, the fact that the price spells are all fit together to create a great wall of price data. Now, so if you're just interested in the distribution of durations, you can use the frequency. What do I mean by the frequency? Well, you can look for each month and you can ask a question, what proportion of firms change per month? And that's what I call H bar. Now you can look at this at a disaggregated level. You can look at a particular type of thing, like food and alcoholic beverages or hotels and restaurants. Or you can look at the aggregate level across all of the CPI data set. Well, in that case, if you look at the frequency of price change, H bar, then the mean duration is simply going to be, 1 over H bar. Now, I'll come back to that. So I'm just going to show you some data here, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. I'll ignore most of this. So these are the names, these are the items which you look at in the CPI data set. So you have something for newspapers, vehicle tolls, legal fees. There's a lot of taxi fares. Okay. This thing here, this is American data. There's a thing called the entry list item level. This is the number that's given for the data. And here's the frequency, which unfortunately you can't see very well. But this is like for coin-operated laundromats, 1.2% of prices change per month. And here at the bottom, for plumbing, supplies and equipment, 6% change per month. Okay, and there's a lot of data. These are things which change price very infrequently. They're ranked, so this is the least frequent, and it becomes more frequent. And there's a few pages. There's a lot of stuff there. I'm not going to go through it. But but we end up at the other end here. Actually, there's more to go. There we go. We end up with petrol, or as the Americans call it, gasoline. And we can see there that 78.9% of petrol prices change per month. And we see other things change very frequently: tomatoes, lettuce, eggs, fresh fruits. So these things are very frequently changing price. The things at the other end were changing less frequently. And if we go in the middle, here for example, just checking new motorcycles, 24.3%, about a quarter change each month. So that's it. So there's a lot of variety, heterogeneity in the data, and we can look at this frequency of price change. And the mean duration of a price spell is equal to 1 over the proportion in discrete time. For those of you who do statistics, it's a Bernoulli distribution. And in continuous time, there's a slightly different formula, and these formulas are linked by the approximation that log over 1 minus h bar is equal to minus h bar for small h. But that's how you do it. So what does this mean in practice? Well, if we look at the whole CPI data set, for the UK and France, h bar is actually equal to 0.2. It's a little bit less, 19.19, but let's say 0.2. In the US, it's a bit bigger. It's 0.25. Maybe even a little bit bigger than that, near 0.3. Germany, on the other hand, has a much lower frequency, it's 0.11, just over 10%. So that we can immediately imply that in France and Britain, the average price spell will have a duration of about 5 months. In the US, it's a bit shorter, 4 months, and in Germany, it's going to be nearer to 10 months. So we can use the frequency then to answer that question. So that's what the data tells us. Now you can do some other exercises. You can work from the sectoral frequencies at the disaggregated level. You can look at tomatoes and so on and add them up using the CPI data, allowing for heterogeneity. But that's roughly what it is. Now, what does that tell us about nominal rigidity? So when this work was first done, Patrick Kehoe, an American economist, wrote a short article saying challenges for sticky price enthusiasts. And what he said was that from that, observed price stickiness is short. On the empirical side, Bills and Klenow and Krivitsov have dug up some interesting BLS data, which is the CPI data for the US, on individual goods prices, that shows that a key feature of the data is that the average time between price changes is relatively short, about 4 months. So the initial reaction of some economists to this data was to say, well look, there isn't much nominal price rigidity, it doesn't matter. Prices only last about 4 months. So that if you're looking, on average about 4 months, so that if you're looking at macroeconomic models are mainly quarterly, it means that prices at most last for 1 period, maybe 2 periods. So nominal rigidity isn't important. So if you were, you could use this to critique, to make a criticism of New Keynesian macroeconomics and say, well, New Keynesian macroeconomists assume that there's nominal rigidity and it's important, but the data shows it isn't. So that's it. So that was one conclusion I got. As we'll see, this conclusion isn't correct for a variety of reasons. And indeed, Patrick Kehoe has changed his opinion on this matter. But what does the distribution of price spells look like? Well, we can look at it. This is the UK distribution of price spells taken over the period 1996 to 2008. And what you can see is, on the horizontal axis, you have the duration of the price spells, and this is the proportion. So what this says is that about 35% of price spells in the UK last for just 1 month. So there's a lot of short price spells. We go along here, it comes down. So if we look at, say, 6 months, it's about 4%. There's a bit of a spike at 12%, it goes up. So if we look at 12 months, and then but we have this very long fat tail of duration, of price spell durations, with 45 months, for example, there's a small figure there. And the mean is 5.34 months, and the median is 2 months. So 35%, over 35% are 1 month, and about 25% are 2 months. So you can see that the 50% is reached very, very quickly. So it's like 2 months. So it's a very skewed distribution. So you've got a huge number of short price spells. So does this mean that prices at nominal rigidity doesn't matter, because most price spells, over 50% of price spells, just last 1 or 2 months? Well, we'll answer that. But in response to this initial finding, over the next decade, a lot of economists looked at this distribution and they tried to make the mean distribution of price spells look longer, because they wanted to have models where nominal rigidity mattered. So one thing is to simply, how can you raise the average length of a price spell? Well, one thing is to remove short price spells. If you get rid of short price spells, you will raise the average. And how can you get rid of short price spells? Well, the most important one is to get rid of sales. So sometimes sales are what happens when a price is put on, you reduce the price. That's a sale, a promotion. And these are often quite short. So you'll have a promotion that will only last 1 month or maybe 2 months. So you can do that. And there are a variety of ways of doing this. But that's the idea. So you can remove short price spells which you identify as sales. That will certainly increase the average. Secondly, you can replace the actual prices with what are called reference prices. You can say that a variety of authors have done this. So what you can do is you can say that what matters really are not the actual prices, but the reference prices. And you can set all prices equal to the modal price, the most common price in a particular period, defined over a calendar period or a rolling window. So that's something that people do. Why do people do that? Well, what they say is that, okay, prices jump around a bit, but they always tend to come back to a particular level, which is called the reference price. So the price may go down for a sale or may go up or down, but they tend to come back to the same level. And they call that the reference price. And the reference price can remain constant for quite a long time. So that's what they do there. So in this case, if you remove short price spells, or even more, you replace actual prices with reference prices, then you get long price spells. And indeed, the same Patrick Kehoe came back in 2015 in a paper with Midrigan, and the title of the paper is "Prices Are Sticky After All." So it took him just over a decade to reach this conclusion. And he says, economists have interpreted the evidence that prices change every 4 months as implying that sticky prices cannot be important for monetary theory. He omits to say that the economists who said that included himself, or most famously included himself. And said, we predict that the stickiness of the aggregate price level matches that in standard Calvo model or a standard menu cost model in which micro-level prices change about once per year. So he's gone, by doing these things of removing sales and looking at reference prices, he's increased the mean from 4 months to 12 months, about a year. Now, is this the right way of looking at things? Well, it's one way of looking at things, and there's nothing wrong with it. But what I'd like to argue is that the distribution of price spells. How long do I have, by the way? Is it?
You have 50 minutes.
30, fine. So, are there any questions? I'll just stop there briefly. Does anybody have any questions on what I've said up till now?
如果有什么问题都可以问啊，没关系。
No? No, that's okay. So what I'll go on now, I'll just argue that so I've looked at the distribution of price spell, the duration of price spells. So if we look at the raw price data, the average price spell is quite brief. It's about 4 months. If you ignore sales and look at reference prices, this distribution can have quite a long mean. But what I'm going to say is that it's better to look at the cross-sectional distribution, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So, what do we mean? What's the relationship between price spells and nominal rigidity? Well, I'll just ask you to look at an example. So, suppose you have an economy where there are 2 firms. One firm sets the price one firm sets the price Tor times per year, Tor being the Greek letter for T, and one sets the price for the whole year. Okay, so if we look at the 9 firms, set the price for the whole year. So there are 10 firms, 9 set the price for the whole year, and 1 firm sets the price Tor times per year. And the average, the duration of each of those Tor price spells will be 1 over Tor. So for example, 1 firm could set the price 12 times per year, which means the duration is 1/12 of a year, i.e. 1 month. So in total, there'll be 9 plus Tor price spells. there'll be the 9 one-year price spells plus the TOR price spells generated by the one firm. There are 10 firms in total. So if we look at the mean price spell, if we take the average across price spells, we have 9 one-year price spells, TOR, which are 1 over TOR per year price spells, and the total number of price spells is 9 plus TOR. So the mean price spell is 10 over 9 plus TOR. So if TOR was equal to 1, and the one firm also changed its price once a year, the mean price spell will be 1 year. And as TOR gets bigger, the denominator will get bigger and bigger. The numerator remains the same because the TOR and TOR minus 1 cancel out to give us 1. And in a limit, as TOR goes to infinity, the mean price spell will go to 0. And what's happening here is we've got 9 one-year price spells, and the 10th firm is just generating more and more price spells as TOR gets bigger and bigger. And if we're averaging over the price spells, those short price spells are going to come to dominate, and eventually the average price spell will go to 0. The cross-sectional average is the average across firms. It's what I was talking about earlier when I showed you the diagram before. And if you average across firms, you get a completely different answer to that question. So if you're saying what's the average across firms, well, 9 firms set the price for 1 year, so you've got 9 there. And the 10th firm, the one firm, has an average of TOR minus 1. So you're averaging 9 parts of 1 plus TOR 1 part of 1 over TOR, and the number of firms is 10. So you're averaging across the 10 firms. Now you can see immediately that what happens as TOR gets bigger and bigger here is not that the thing goes to 0, but it goes to 0.9. We have 9 plus 1 over TOR, and as TOR goes to infinity, we get to this bit goes to 0, and we're left with 9 over 10. So that's the cross-sectional mean. Now, I would just appeal to your intuition and say, when we talk about nominal rigidity, if we have an economy with 90% of firms having prices fixed for 1 year, then there's a limit to the amount of damage that one firm can do by changing its price all the time. And that's captured by the cross-section perfectly, but it's not captured by the distribution of durations itself. So really what we should look at is the cross-section. That's what matters if we're interested in nominal rigidity. Short prices, the basic insight here is that short prices don't matter as much as long price spells. So, and I'll explain what I mean by that soon. But the point is, if we look at the distribution of price spell durations, it's weighting each price spell as equally important. So the price spell can last for just 1 month, and in the distribution of durations, that's just as important as a price spell that lasts for a year. But in cross-section, that's not the case, because the cross-section weights things by their length. So I'll just explain this and look in a little bit more detail what we mean by the cross-section average. So again, what we do here is we keep the panel structure, we look at the cross-section. So a cross-section essentially is looking at the durations which corresponds to price spells at a particular point in time. So it's actually, if we look at a cross-section, it automatically puts more weight on longer price spells. The reason for this is that you're much more likely to observe a long price spell if you take a cross-section. So, you know, if you walk into a room, and who are you likely to find there? Well, some people might be in the room for long periods every day. Some people might just pop in for a few minutes. So if you look in a room, the people you're most likely to find in that room are the people who stay there all the time. It's the long durations which you're most likely to observe. short durations are much less likely to be observed in cross-section. And in fact, the probability of being observed in cross-section is proportional to the duration of the price spell. So with a cross-section, you keep all price spells in the mix, if you like, all durations of price spells in the mix, but what you do is small, short durations are given a lower weight. So that's the important thing. And in fact, we can actually go back and think of sales, for example, in the earlier approach, just left out sales and gave them a zero weight. In this approach, you keep sales in, even if they only last for 1 month, but you just give them a lower weight. So we can look at two distributions here. One I've called the distribution of durations, alpha ID, and the other the distribution, the cross-sectional one. And how are they linked? Well, they're linked in a very, very simple way, and I'll show you how this works out soon. So the distribution of durations is simply equal to the distribution, the cross-sectional distribution, divided by IH. I think that's the wrong way around, isn't it? Sorry, this is the wrong way around. So that should be the distribution of durations. That should be alpha I. And that should be alpha ID, and that should be alpha I. Apologies for that, I've done it the wrong way around. But the two distributions are linked in a very simple manner. And what matters is I, the length of the duration, and H bar, the frequency, the proportion of firms changing price each month. So for example, in the UK data, we've got H bar, the proportion of firms changing price is 0.2. And we have a distribution of income, and we can transform, we can move from one to the other. I'll just show you this. It's probably easier if I do it like here. So here then, this was the diagram I showed you before. So for the UK, the proportion of durations lasting 1 month is 24%. We multiply it by I times H bar. H bar is 0.2, I is 1 here. So to go from the distribution of durations to the cross-section, we multiply by 0.2, so we go from 24.25 to 4.85. For the two period durations, it's 12%. Actually, the figures are, this must be the French data actually. It's 12%. So H bar times 2 is 0.4. So 0.4 times 12% gives us 4.87%. And this thing is simply 0.2 times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 0.2 times 5 is 1. So this thing increases. This is the distribution of the distribution of durations, and this is its corresponding cross-sectional one. So basically, as you go to longer and longer durations, you blow up the distribution of durations by more. So they cross over around about here. So at 5 months, the two are equal, and above that, this one is bigger than that one. Below that, this one is bigger than that one. So that, I think, is actually for French data, not for UK data. But we can look at the two UK distributions here, and we can see we've got the cross-section. The mean is 10.9, the median 7.8. For durations, the mean is 5.3, the median 2. This is the durations. This is the cross-sectional one. So we can see all of these, there's a lot of short-run durations, but in cross-section, they become much less important. Whereas the long tail, I've cut it off at 30 months here, the long tail, on the other hand, is much more important in the cross-section because long price spells get weighted much more. And those are the distributions of the French data. Yes, those figures were the French figures I was looking at. But that's what it looks like. So this is for the French data. You get a similar sort of thing for France. So the actual figures are different for the French data, but the overall picture is similar. In France, there's a bit more seasonality. They have a bit more of a 12-month spike here. And they also have a 6-month spike, which is a little bit in the UK data, but not so much. But apart from that, they're very, very similar. What about the US? Well, unfortunately, nobody's actually applied this methodology directly to the US data. But there is, in one of the papers, they do provide the some statistics for it. And I was able, Peter now sent me the data, and I was able to use it. I don't think this data is actually correct for this methodology, but the overall picture is, so here's the distribution of durations in the American case, and here's the cross-sectional one. And again, the figures look very similar, but they're a bit low, and that's because of the way that the hazard function was estimated by Hunan and Krivitsov. But you need to do it slightly differently to get consistent data with the figures I gave you for the French and British data. But it looks pretty much the same. Again, it doesn't have a 6-month spike, but it has a bit of a 12-month spike. So that's the US data. So it looks pretty similar in all three countries. You've got a big fat tail of long durations in the cross-sectional. So in the UK case, over 40% of prices last more than 12 months. 15% last more than 24 months, that's 2 years. 3.7 lasts more than 3 years. So some prices last for a very long time. Now I gave you the example of Poundland, where the prices are always £1. So if there's the same product that's been there for many years, it will have the same price. I always give the example, when I give this talk, of the price of wine in one of my favourite restaurants in London. There's a restaurant called the Ravi Shankar restaurant in London. It's an Indian restaurant which serves Indian vegetarian food. So it's quite a specialist restaurant. And I like Indian vegetarian food, so I go there. And their house wine, organic house wine, costs the same. I think it was £8.99 for about 10 or 12 years. So the price didn't change for 10 or 12 years. Then I noticed a few years ago, it was refurbished, they repainted it and changed the furniture, and then the price of the wine changed. But for a long time it was the same. So there are some prices which last for a very, very long time. And in fact, if you look at both the UK and French data sets, which last for 12 years, there are some prices in that 12 years which never changed. So that's the nature of the data. So what I'd argue is that there's a lot of nominal rigidity in the economy as a result of that. So just to go back, yes, to take it. So the conclusion so far is simply to say that if you do have fixed prices which remain fixed for a long time, they can affect the whole way the economy works. And if we take this cross-sectional approach, what I would argue is that it reveals the importance and the extent of nominal rigidity in a very simple and intuitive manner. You can reach a similar conclusion by looking at the distribution of price durations, by applying all these various filters. And in fact, the cross-sectional filter is a bit like a filter. So what you're doing is you're filtering by giving different weights to different price spell durations. So the two approaches are in a sense equivalent, but I think it's more intuitive to look at the cross-sectional distribution. Now there is another paper by two economists, Baharad and Eden. They wrote a paper, they answered a slightly different question. So these two economists, they're not both Israeli actually, one of them is an Israeli, the other isn't. But they published the paper in 2004, and they just, rather than looking at a panel of price spells, they asked a different question. If a single firm has a variety of price spell durations, it sets its price over time, and some of those price spells are long and some are short, how do you aggregate them up? So to answer the question of how much rigidity is there with a single firm. So it's sort of aggregating it more over the time dimension. And okay, they realised if you simply look at the average of price spells, it will lead to too much weight on shorter spells. Because when you take an average over spells, each spell has the same weight, and a short spell will have the same weight as a long spell. This doesn't make sense. And again, I'll just give you a very simple example. So suppose you've got one firm, it keeps its price constant for 364 days, but on the last day of the year, it changes its price times. It changes its price a lot of times. What's the mean duration? What does it mean there's a lot of rigidity? Is there a significant nominal rigidity? Well, the short answer is yes, there is, because the price remains fixed for nearly the whole year. It's only for one day that the price varies a few times. But if we look at the duration of price spells, we get a very similar answer to what we had before. So the mean duration of the price spell in days, we've got one price spell which is 364 plus tau times tau over -1 divided by 364 plus tau. Now, if we look at the mean duration of the price spell, because we've got the tau in the denominator there, what happens is that as tau goes to infinity, the mean price spell will go to 0, because each of those price spells in the last day is counting equally as the one which lasts for 364 days. So the mean price spell will go to 0 as tau goes to infinity. So I don't think this is a good measure of price stickiness. The average duration of the price spell is not a good measure of price stickiness. So what happens in just one day shouldn't be able to wipe out the fact that the price was rigid for 364 days. So what Baharad and Eden proposed was a different measure, which is again that we weight the durations by how long they lasted. So I was looking at this in cross-sectional, applying this as a cross-sectional. They would say even if you just look at one sequence of price spells, longer price spells will occupy more time and are hence more important. And really, if you're measuring the mean across time or per price, to use their technology, you get a different answer, which is of course that the actual mean price spell is going to, the 1 over t bit will disappear, but you're still left with round about 364, approximately just a little bit less than 364 days left, if each price spell is weighted by its duration. So in Baharad and Eden, weighting by duration gives you a much more accurate representation of nominal rigidity than the mean price spell. And what I show is, in another paper, is that these two are exactly equivalent. The cross-sectional one and the Baharad and Eden one are exactly equivalent in steady state. So if you have a steady state where each cross-section is the same, they're identical. So in fact, if Patrick Keogh had read this paper back in 2004, he would have realised that prices were sticky after all 10 years earlier. But unfortunately, this paper by Baharad and Eden is rarely cited. It's one of those cases where it's a brilliant paper which really pins down the issues very, very well, but the mainstream literature just ignored it and went on and did other things. They could have saved themselves a decade having paid more attention to this very, very important and well-written paper. Okay, now no one's yet done the cross-section for the US, so hopefully they will do soon. It'd be nice to see that done. Now, and I've done it for the French data, for the Eurozone and UK data, and it'd be nice to do it for Chinese data too. So, what are the implications for macroeconomic theory? Well, they're quite important. Most commonly used theories in macroeconomics assume that in some sense there are perfectly flexible prices. I mean this in the sense that price change every month or quarter. And so a lot of macroeconomics isn't consistent with the macro data. Let me just explain what I mean by this. There are some quite popular models. I'll just go through 3. Sticky information. This is a model which was put forward by, well, it originates with Stanley Fischer back in the 1970s, but in its most recent incarnation is with Ricardo Rice and Greg Mankiw. And again, what it assumes is that prices are perfectly flexible, but they don't react to the latest information. The information they reflect is old information. So information is sticky in the sense it lasts for a long time because firms don't update their price plans very frequently. But the underlying assumption is that prices change every month in the sticky information model. There's another variant on this, it's slightly different, rational inattention. Again, that was originally a model by Chris Sims, but it's become well known under the incarnation of Makowiak and Wiederholt. And again, this looks at it assumes that prices are perfectly flexible, but again, they don't react to the latest information. And the reason they don't react to the latest information is that firms are optimally being inattentive. There's rational inattention. They're solving the Sims information management problem, and what that means is that they don't update their information all the time. But again, the prices may not be up to date in the information dimension, but they're being changed every month. Lastly, there's the assumption of indexation. Now, this is very common in new Keynesian models, for example, the famous Smets and Voutas model, and many others as well. And what that says is that prices, even when they're not being set by firms directly, are being updated or indexed to respond to recent inflation. And again, this means that prices are changing every period. Now, all three of these models, they're quite popular. You can see them being used in papers that are written, published by top journals and other journals. But they're all completely inconsistent with the notion that prices, they all assume that prices change every period. So in a sense, they're fundamentally inconsistent with the microeconomic data which we have. Now, you can rewrite the models, sticky information and rational intention. They don't need to assume that prices are perfectly flexible. You can write them so that you have with fixed sticky prices, and there are a couple of papers which do that, but most papers don't. Indexation, it's impossible by definition almost to make that consistent with the data, and at best that can be viewed as a convenient fiction. Macroeconomists want a model that fits the data. They can ignore the micro data because they're mainly interested in the macro data, so they invent this fiction of indexation, and the model works as if this fiction were true. But as a scientist, that's not a very satisfactory way to go about things. It's better to try and come up with theories which are actually consistent with reality. Okay, so what's the conclusion? So firstly, I hope I've argued, I managed to persuade you that nominal rigidity matters. There are general equilibrium effects. So nominal rigidity in one sector can affect how the rest of the economy behaves. This is important for macro, in particular, but it also can apply to any general equilibrium modelling, taxation, and so on. And in macro, under certain assumptions, it can have a big effect on the economy. And certainly, the work I've done in a variety of different settings suggests that quite a modest level of nominal rigidity can have quite a big effect on how the economy behaves, using empirically plausible calibrations and so on. So how do we measure nominal rigidity? Well, I would argue that we need to look at the cross-section, the distribution across prices or firms, and that this is the best way to capture the structure of the economy, how the economy is behaving, because it's the firms, how they behave, which determines how the economy behaves. And that structure of nominal rigidity is best captured by looking at the cross-section. And this implies, I think it's a better way of looking at it than the current orthodoxy, where you filter out sales and you look at reference prices. I mean, the cross-section is in effect a filter. It does give less weights to sales, but I think it just makes more sense intuitively. And it can also be used where there's just one price, and it's equivalent to the aggregation that Bahar and Meaden suggested back in 2004, looking across time. So what do we have in practice when we look at the data? Well, we have a mixture of flexible and rigid prices. I showed you the distributions earlier. We have a long fat tail of rigid prices in the UK. There's a small proportion, a small share of prices which last for 2 years, 3 years and beyond. We can go back now and look back at the 1930s debate. Rufus Tucker and Gardner Means, the two US economists. And so nominal rigidity has been a feature of US prices for as far back as records go. And if we look at Europe, the IPN across the Eurozone, France, UK, US, in the past people could always say sticky prices did not matter and could be ignored before this evidence came into being. So the CPI data didn't really become available till the early 2000s. So before that there wasn't very much data on prices. There was individual studies of individual industries, biscuits, newspapers and so on, but there was no generic thing. So people could always say, well, prices are flexible. But I think now, since this evidence has become available, if you look at it correctly, prices are sticky, and you need to take account of this if you want to model a general equilibrium system, as you do on average. And if we look at the CPI data in France, the UK and the US, it all says that average prices last about 12 months on average. Okay, lots of prices change more frequently. In the example, the US example, tomatoes, petrol or gasoline, some of them change prices every month, but there's that big, long, fat tail of prices which only don't change at all. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.
May I ask you some question?
Yes?
Yes. I have a question. As you said, in 2004, Bahar and Eden, their paper is very good, but now there's still very small number of sites. And we know that in this area, people know that the heterogeneity is becoming more and more important. So lots of models focus on to model the heterogeneity. They know this feature, but they still use the wrong way to measure the aggregate rigidity or the other one, right? So my question is, how do you plan to sell your point view to the mainstream economists?
Well, I think it's a difficult question. I mean, scientific orthodoxy, by their nature, tend to be conservative. It's difficult to change them. So, people have done something in a particular way for a while. They keep on doing it in that way. And so so I just keep going on developing this approach, showing how it works, and I think hopefully people will eventually see that it's the most sensible way of looking at things. And the things I'm working on at the moment, for example, are the econometrics of how you estimate these distributions, the cross-sectional distribution in particular. And my latest work is showing how you can estimate the cross-section and the distribution of the distributions. And I think developing more and more tools for exploring the cross-section distribution will make it easier and easier for people to do it. On the other hand, the other thing to do with orthodoxies is to pretend that there hasn't really been, to have a smooth transition. And as I say, the filtering which is going on at the moment, using reference prices and leaving out sales, is in a sense just using another filtering. So I can simply say, this is just another filter, and it's easier to use. You don't have to get rid of sales or do the you can just use the raw price data and weight it by its duration. And so it's a similar sort of filter. So maybe that's another thing, to pretend that it isn't an alternative, it's just another variation of what people are doing already. So I have two strategies. Whether they will work or not, you'll invite me back in 10 years and we'll see.
Thank you. One more question is about the inflation target. Because nowadays we in China we also have some research on inflation target. We know that there is an argument between target the headline inflation or core inflation. And the core inflation means that we get rid of the food price and energy price, which are most flexible price sectors. And what's your opinion to this? Again, this is kind of a filter.
Yes, so that's it. So the argument here is that some sectors' prices are very flexible, as you're saying, more on prices which change less frequently, what's sometimes called core inflation. Well, I say that I've done some research at the Bank of England on this with economists at the Bank of England, and we came up with a conclusion that the optimal policy basically means that you just ignore what's happening with petrol prices. So that's a very specific meaning of core inflation. But yeah, I think there is some argument for leaving out more frequently changing prices. But it's hard to define, what we mean exactly by core inflation. And I think a lot of the analysis of core inflation either uses some sort of detrended statistical measure, which is fairly arbitrary, or some more or less arbitrary formal definition. And I think what you need to do is you need to dig down into the data and have a framework for saying what is the best way to do it. So that that's what we did at the Bank of England. We allowed for the inflation target to put different weights on each different CPI sector, and then we said, well, what's the best system of weights to have? And I think you need to start look at it from that way, rather than just saying, well, we've got to just look at core inflation, and this is how we define core inflation. It depends how you define core, and if you look at the books, there are many different ways of defining core inflation. And I think just using some sort of arbitrary filter isn't the right way to do it at all.
我们同学还有别，就是可以问很宽泛的问题啊，不一定就是今天的他这个讲座内容。我们同学英文问问题没有信心的话，你也可以用中文我帮你翻译，好吗 ？Any questions?同学们有问题吗？不用紧张啊，可以放松的问，是吧？很难得的机会。
我问个啦。中国这个后期是不是进入一个温和的一个通胀期，还是有一个什么样的预期？
好，this question from our Dr. Len. She's our staff, and she wanted to ask that we observe a situation that in China, in recent years, especially this year, the CPI inflation becomes higher and higher. And whether do you think this kind of situation will last for longer and become a new normal? And how about maybe for the UK and the US after all those years low inflation?
Well, it depends what. Essentially, central banks have the ability, if they want to keep inflation low. Essentially, they can raise interest rates, for example, and there are many different mechanisms how this can work. So I think ultimately, if central banks and behind them the governments or the regimes, political regimes that govern their behaviour, want to, they can control inflation. And we can see historically there have been periods when inflation has been high, and essentially in those periods typically the governments or the central banks haven't been willing to tackle inflation, or they were ignorant about how inflation happened. If we go back to the hyperinflation in Germany in the 1920s, people didn't really understand inflation very well. And indeed, if we look at the 1970s in Britain, in America and Britain and so on, when we had relatively high inflation. Again, you can say that the politicians and civil servants didn't really understand what inflation was. But I think we do understand what inflation is now, and we do know how to deal with it. The question is whether we can have the political will to act against inflation. So I can't speak about China because I don't know what the political thinking is in China. But certainly in the US and the UK, it looks as if the central bank, the Bank of England, is willing to accept higher inflation. Just recently, 2 months ago, Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, said that because of the devaluation in the pound recently, there's going to be more inflation, it'll be above target, and they're not going to do anything about it. So he's basically announced that the Bank of England is just going to let inflation happen. So it'll probably reach 3% or 4%. The Bank of England could quite easily stop the inflation if it raised its interest rates. Inflation's been at 0. Inflation, the interest rate's at 0.5%. Inflation's gone up to 1%. They can just raise the interest rate. Now I can go into why the Bank of England isn't going to do it. I think it's a mistake. I think they should keep inflation down. The US, well, the main driver of the UK inflation is the devaluation of the pound. And I think that if interest rates in Britain rose, the pound would rapidly go back up again. In short. The US is a different story. I mean, the US hasn't had much inflation in recent history. But of course, with a new fiscal, there are many possibilities what might happen when Trump comes into power. And certainly one possibility, he's building a big wall and he's going to rebuild the US infrastructure. The US already has a fairly large budget deficit. So if the budget deficit in the US goes up, some people predict this might lead to a new inflationary period in the US. I don't know. So that's a possibility. Whether that will actually happen or not, I really don't know. It depends on lots of other things. It's a little bit harder to predict. But certainly it is one possibility. So do I think there's a new inflationary normal? No, I don't. I mean, in the Eurozone, there's not much inflation. The Eurozone is the same size as the US economy, so I don't think there's going to be lots of inflation all over the place. But in some countries, for political reasons, there may be a lack of will to address inflation for various reasons, good or bad. And so that you may observe an inflationary episode. In China, I can't really see why you would want to have inflation, but certainly you have had inflation in the last 10 or 20 years. You've had periods of quite high inflation in China relative to Europe and the US. It's been low recently, but it could go back up again. So yeah.
那我们就非常感谢Dixon 教授给我们带来的这个非常的一个接受的程度，还需要一些消化的一些时间，所以我们今天可能从这个短暂的时间里面，我看大家可能也很难问出很多的问题，是吧？但是的话，我希望呢，通过这次机会，给大家一个更加的有一个明确的方向，因为我们在座的同学很多都是研究生、博士，这样子的话。就是说，看看现在国际上做这个研究的，他们的一个这样子比较规范的、比较严谨的一个方式是什么？然后我们呢，可能在今后的这个学习和研究中呢，更加的注重对于这种最前沿的这个研究的一个追踪和一个这样子的分析。我也希望在下一次，如果我们在组织这样子的全英文的这个讲座的时候呢，大家可以更加的踊跃参与到其中来，这样子对你的这个进步呢也会更加大。好了，那我们最后呢，请我们用热烈的掌声感谢 Dixon 教授给我们带来的这样子的一场很有收获的这样的一个讲座。好，谢谢 ，Thank you。好，我们讲座到此结束。